From penis-shaped prosthetic noses to Tupac's film debut, Dan Aykroyd's directorial disaster is a treasure trove of bizarre Hollywood history. This 1991 box office bomb features cannibalistic roller coasters, giant mutant babies, and a critic so disturbed he refused to review it. With feuding co-stars, budget overruns, and dreams turned into nightmare fuel, this film pushed weirdness to extraordinary limits. Here are 15 weird facts about Nothing But Trouble you never knew. Fact 1. Judge's nose was deliberately penis-shaped. One of the most talked about aspects of Nothing But Trouble is something that viewers often can't believe they're actually seeing on screen. Dan Aykroyd's character, Judge Alvin Valkenheiser, sports a grotesque prosthetic nose that was intentionally designed to look like male genitalia. This wasn't some accidental resemblance that slipped past the production team or a trick of lighting that made people do a double take. The nose was deliberately sculpted to resemble a penis, and what makes this even stranger is that multiple versions of the prosthetic were created specifically to emphasize this anatomical similarity. During certain scenes in the film, particularly the infamous dinner sequence, where the judge eats a hot dog while Chevy Chase's character makes a disgusted face, the production team would actually swap out Aykroyd's standard prosthetic nose for an alternative version that looked even more phallic. If you watch closely during these moments, you can see the tip of the nose bears an unmistakable resemblance to the head of a penis, complete with detailed sculpting that leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. The most prominent example occurs when the camera catches the judge in profile while he's lasciviously shaking and consuming a gray frankfurter, creating a deeply uncomfortable visual that many critics pointed out as emblematic of the film's overall approach to humor. What's particularly fascinating about this creative choice is that it represents a conscious decision by Aykroyd as both director and actor. In the film's storyline, the nose is actually supposed to be a fake prosthetic that the ancient judge wears to disguise his even more grotesque, mummified appearance underneath. This means that within the world of the movie, the judge himself chose to wear a nose shaped like a penis. That's a character choice that Aykroyd, wearing multiple hats as writer, director, and star, deliberately included in his vision for the film. Critics and audiences have spent decades trying to understand the artistic reasoning behind this provocative design element, but it remains one of the film's most bizarre and memorable features that people simply cannot unsee once they notice it. Fact 2. Roger Ebert refused to write review. When legendary film critic Roger Ebert attended a screening of Nothing But Trouble in February of 1991, he had what can only be described as one of the worst movie-going experiences of his professional career. Ebert, who reviewed thousands of films over his decades-long career at the Chicago Sun-Times, was so profoundly disturbed by Dan Aykroyd's directorial debut that he took the extremely rare step of refusing to write a formal written review of the film. This was something Ebert almost never did, making his reaction to Nothing But Trouble particularly significant in the movie's troubled history. What makes this story even more remarkable is what happened during the actual screening. Ebert later recounted on his television show Siskel and Ebert that he watched the film on a Tuesday night in a nearly empty theater. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, 3 teenagers were making an enormous amount of noise, not just talking loudly among themselves, but actually shouting and screaming throughout the movie. Under normal circumstances, this kind of disturbance would infuriate any filmgoer trying to concentrate on what was happening on screen. However, Ebert's reaction was completely the opposite. At one point during the screening, he actually turned around to the rowdy teenagers and asked them if they could talk even louder. He genuinely preferred listening to their disruptive behavior rather than paying attention to the movie itself. Although Ebert declined to put his thoughts into a formal written review, he did appear on his show to discuss the film alongside Gene Siskel, where both critics gave it an emphatic thumbs down. During that television segment, Ebert described Nothing But Trouble as an all-time turkey, with the thumbs going way, way down and completely out of sight. The film would later appear on their annual Worst Films of 1991 episode, cementing its place in cinema history as one of the most critically reviled comedies ever made. Fact 3. Tupac Shakur's first film appearance. Nothing But Trouble holds a surprising place in hip-hop history as the very first film appearance of Tupac Shakur, one of the most influential rappers of all time. In 1991, Tupac was still a backup dancer and hype man for the Oakland-based rap group Digital Underground, and when the group was cast in Dan Aykroyd's bizarre comedy, the young artist came along for what would become his on-screen debut. The scene features Digital Underground being pulled over for speeding and brought before Judge Valkenheiser's courtroom, where they are ordered to prove they're actually musicians by performing on the spot. The group launches into their song, Same Song, with Tupac appearing as part of the ensemble, while Dan Aykroyd's elderly judge character unexpectedly joins in by playing a massive pipe organ, surrounded by dancing women grinding against him in one of the film's strangest musical moments. This marked Tupac's first appearance in both film and in a major music release, as Same Song was featured on the movie's soundtrack and became his recording debut under the name Tupac. The song's music video, which incorporated footage from the film, received heavy rotation on MTV and introduced Tupac to a mainstream audience beyond the underground hip-hop scene. In the video, Tupac portrays an African king while other Digital Underground members take on various cultural personas, with Dan Aykroyd making cameo appearances in different costumes. While the film itself was a critical and commercial disaster that most of the cast would prefer to forget, it inadvertently launched the career of one of the greatest rappers in history. Tupac would go on to release his debut solo album, Tupacalypse Now, later that same year, beginning a legendary but tragically short career that would cement his status as a cultural icon. Fact 4. Both John Hughes and John Landis rejected it before Dan Aykroyd ever stepped behind the camera to direct Nothing But Trouble. The script went through the hands of two of Hollywood's most successful comedy directors, and both of them wanted nothing to do with it. The first person Aykroyd approached was John Hughes, the legendary filmmaker behind classics like The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Home Alone. Hughes had a reputation for understanding comedy and had worked successfully with many of the same actors in Aykroyd's circle, so he seemed like a natural choice to helm this bizarre horror comedy project. While Hughes was genuinely interested in the story and found the concept intriguing, he ultimately turned down the opportunity for a very specific reason. He had a strict personal rule that he would only direct screenplays he had written himself. Hughes was known for maintaining complete creative control over his projects, and directing someone else's script, even one as wild as Nothing But Trouble, simply didn't fit his working style. Despite declining the directing job, Hughes was still given a special thanks credit in the final film. After Hughes passed, Aykroyd took the script to John Landis, another comedy heavyweight who had directed films like Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and Trading Places. Landis had previously worked with Aykroyd on multiple projects and seemed like another logical choice to bring this strange vision to life. However, Landis had a much stronger reaction to the material than Hughes did. He didn't just politely decline the project, he actively disliked the script and immediately turned it down without hesitation. With both directors rejecting the film and Warner Brothers eager to move forward with the project because they wanted John Candy attached as a co-star, Aykroyd found himself in a difficult position. He reluctantly agreed to direct the film himself just to get the deal secured, even though he had no prior directing experience. This decision to take on the triple duty of writer, director, and lead actor while also playing a second role in heavy prosthetic makeup would prove to be an enormous challenge that contributed to the film's troubled production. Fact 5. Inspired by a real traffic stop. The entire premise of Nothing But Trouble came from a genuinely bizarre experience that happened to Dan Aykroyd back in 1978, and it's one of those real-life stories that sounds too strange to be true. Aykroyd was riding his motorcycle through a small rural town somewhere in upstate New York when he got pulled over by a local police officer for speeding. Now, getting a speeding ticket is annoying enough, but what happened next turned into something completely surreal that would eventually inspire one of the weirdest movies ever made. Instead of just writing him a ticket on the side of the road like you'd expect, the police officer told Aykroyd he needed to come with him immediately to face the local justice of the peace. Keep in mind, this was happening in the middle of the night, which already made the whole situation feel pretty unsettling. So Aykroyd had to follow the officer to what he later described as a kangaroo court, where he was brought before the justice of the peace for an impromptu trial right then and there. The whole setup felt absurdly informal and oddly intimidating at the same time, like something out of a movie where a big city person gets trapped in a strange small town with its own rules. After the justice of the peace fined him $50 for the speeding violation, Aykroyd probably thought he was done and could finally get back on the road. But then things got even weirder. The justice of the peace invited him to stay for tea, and what Aykroyd assumed would be a quick, polite cup of tea turned into an entire evening. He ended up sitting there in this stranger's home for 4 full hours, just drinking tea and making conversation in the middle of the night after being hauled into court. Years later, when Aykroyd and his brother Peter were brainstorming ideas for a horror comedy, this strange traffic stop experience became the foundation for the entire story, transforming a late-night tea session into a nightmarish adventure in the fictional town of Vulcanvania. Fact 6. Hellraiser screening sparked the concept. The entire concept for Nothing But Trouble came from an unusual movie theater experience in 1987 that had nothing to do with comedy. Producer Robert K. Weiss had recently fractured a rib and was in considerable pain, so he suggested to Dan and Peter Aykroyd that they all go see a movie together to take his mind off the injury. The catch was that it couldn't be a comedy because laughing would hurt too much with his broken rib, so they decided on a horror film instead and chose Clive Barker's Hellraiser, which had just been released. As the three of them sat in the theater watching this genuinely disturbing horror movie about demonic puzzle boxes and sadomasochistic creatures from another dimension, something unexpected happened. The audience around them started laughing at the scary parts. Instead of screaming or gasping in terror, people were finding the extreme gore and grotesque imagery funny. This bizarre reaction struck Weiss as fascinating, and right there in the theater, he turned to the Aykroyd brothers and suggested they should make a horror comedy together, since audiences clearly wanted to laugh and be scared at the same time. That single screening became the creative spark that led to Nothing But Trouble. Peter Aykroyd then remembered a strange incident from 1978 when his brother Dan had been pulled over for speeding in a small town in upstate New York and ended up in what Dan described as a kangaroo court run by a local justice of the peace. After paying his $50 fine, the justice of the peace invited Dan to stay for tea, and he ended up spending 4 hours in this odd rural courthouse. The Aykroyd brothers realized they could combine this real-life experience with the horror comedy concept that Weiss had proposed, creating a story about wealthy city people trapped in a nightmarish small town with a sadistic judge. Dan Aykroyd spent the next 6 months writing the screenplay, which he originally titled Git, and later changed to Road to Ruin, describing it as a monster movie that blended elements of Beetlejuice and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the comedic sensibilities of Saturday Night Live. Fact 7. Mr. Bone Stripper had its own theme song. One of the most memorable and disturbing elements in Nothing But Trouble is the death machine called Mr. Bone Stripper, and what makes it even more surreal is that it came with its own custom rock anthem. The hard rock band Damn Yankees, which featured members Tommy Shaw from Styx and Ted Nugent, recorded an original theme song specifically for this roller coaster of death that plays every single time the contraption appears on screen. The song kicks in with heavy guitar riffs as victims are strapped into a rickety roller coaster that winds through the junkyard before dumping them onto a conveyor belt that feeds them through flames and into a massive set of mechanical teeth that literally strips the flesh from their bones. The finished skeletons then get shot out of a pipe in the back, landing on a pile with cartoon sound effects like pinball machines. What makes this collaboration particularly strange is that Damn Yankees was a legitimate rock supergroup at the time, having just released their self-titled debut album in 1990, which went double platinum and produced the hit single High Enough. For their follow-up work, they chose to contribute music to a Dan Aykroyd comedy about a cannibalistic judge in a decaying New Jersey town. The theme song doesn't have lyrics, but serves as an instrumental backdrop that somehow makes the already disturbing execution device even more theatrical and over the top. Dan Aykroyd gave his crew free rein to design whatever came to mind, which is why the production went $5 million over budget. And the Bone Stripper represented one of the most expensive and elaborate set pieces in the entire film. The combination of hair metal aesthetics with a cartoonish death trap created a tonal clash that confused audiences who weren't sure whether they were watching a comedy or a horror film. But the musical accompaniment certainly made the Bone Stripper one of the most unforgettable and bizarre elements in a movie that's already packed with weirdness from start to finish. Fact 8. Based on Centralia's underground coal fire. The fictional town of Valkenvania in Nothing But Trouble wasn't just dreamed up out of thin air by Dan Aykroyd. The decaying, dangerous hamlet sitting atop an underground coal fire was directly inspired by Centralia, Pennsylvania, a real American ghost town with one of the most bizarre and tragic stories in the country's history. Centralia was once a thriving mining community in Columbia County, Pennsylvania, sitting on top of 25 million tons of anthracite coal. During its peak in the late 1800s, the town had 5 hotels, 7 churches, 27 saloons, and 14 general stores. But everything changed in 1962 when county workers were burning trash in a landfill that happened to be located in a former strip mine. The fire ignited a coal seam underground, and what started as a small mistake became an unstoppable inferno that has been burning continuously ever since. By the time Dan Aykroyd began developing Nothing But Trouble, in the late 1980s, Centralia had become a modern ghost town. The underground fire made the ground unstable and released toxic gases through cracks in the earth. Residents had to evacuate as their town literally collapsed beneath them. The federal government eventually condemned most of the properties and relocated the population. Today, only a handful of people still live there among the abandoned streets and empty lots where homes once stood. Aykroyd used Centralia's nightmare scenario as the perfect backdrop for his horror comedy. Just like the real Centralia, Valkenvania sits atop a perpetually burning coal mine that threatens to swallow the entire town. The film even shows smoke and flames erupting from the ground around the courthouse. Aykroyd also borrowed the story of how Centralia's economy was destroyed by bad investments, giving Judge Valkenheiser a backstory where corrupt bankers ruined his family's fortune through a disastrous coal deal decades earlier. The film's climax even features the underground fire finally consuming the judge's courthouse, mirroring the real-life destruction that wiped Centralia off the map. The coal fire in Centralia is expected to continue burning for at least another 250 years. Fact 9. Crew member threatened Chevy Chase. Behind the scenes of Nothing But Trouble, tensions ran so high that one crew member allegedly threatened physical violence against Chevy Chase if he didn't stop his abusive behavior toward director Dan Aykroyd. Chase, who was known throughout Hollywood for being difficult to work with, reportedly made the production miserable for nearly everyone involved, and his treatment of the first-time director pushed things to a breaking point. According to reports from the set, Chase was openly dismissive of Aykroyd's abilities as a director and made his feelings known to anyone who would listen. The tension became especially uncomfortable when Chase would brag that he was more valuable to the production than Aykroyd because his paycheck was 3 times larger than the director's salary. Chase used this pay disparity as ammunition to belittle Aykroyd in front of cast and crew members, creating an incredibly hostile work environment for everyone on set. The situation escalated to such a degree that one particularly fed-up crew member finally snapped and delivered an ultimatum to Chase. The crew member told him in no uncertain terms that if he continued speaking to Aykroyd with such disrespect, he would drop a brick on Chase's head. While it's unclear whether this was meant as a literal threat or simply an expression of extreme frustration, the incident demonstrates just how protective the crew had become of Aykroyd and how toxic Chase's presence had made the production. Interestingly, Chase would reportedly call his co-stars at night after filming to apologize for what he described as stressed-out behavior. But this pattern of abuse, followed by apologies, is often characteristic of difficult personalities in the workplace. Bertila Damas, who played one of the Brazilian characters, later confirmed that while she enjoyed working with Demi Moore and Taylor Negron, she absolutely did not get along with Chase, who already had a well-established reputation for being challenging to work with on film sets throughout his career. Fact 10. Dan Aykroyd played 2 characters in heavy makeup. Dan Aykroyd didn't just write and direct nothing but trouble, he also took on the demanding challenge of playing 2 completely different characters, both requiring extensive prosthetic makeup that took several hours to apply each day. The first character was Judge Alvin Valkenheiser, the ancient, decrepit 106-year-old magistrate who serves as the film's main antagonist, and the second was Bobo, one of the grotesque giant mutant baby twins who live in the town's junkyard. The Judge Valkenheiser makeup was particularly intensive, transforming Aykroyd into what critics described as looking like a breathing liver spot, with discolored teeth, wrinkled skin, and that infamous prosthetic nose. Every morning before filming, Aykroyd would sit in the makeup chair for hours while artists applied layers of prosthetics to create the character's hideous, mummified appearance. The transformation was so complete that Aykroyd was essentially buried beneath the makeup, making him virtually unrecognizable. But playing the judge wasn't enough. Aykroyd also agreed to play Bobo, the hairless giant mutant baby, after discovering that nobody else wanted to take on the role. This meant even more time in the makeup chair and additional physical demands, as the Bobo costume required him to portray a massive, diaper-wearing infant who plays cards and leers at the female characters. Aykroyd later admitted that juggling these 2 heavily made-up roles while simultaneously directing and producing the film was incredibly stressful. The decision to take on both parts added significant pressure to an already complicated production. Aykroyd was essentially doing the work of 3 people, switching between characters while trying to manage the entire film as a first-time director. The heavy prosthetics also meant he couldn't easily communicate with his crew or actors, and the physical discomfort of spending hours in makeup each day while directing took its toll. Despite the challenges, Aykroyd committed fully to both performances, bringing manic energy to the judge and unsettling creepiness to Bobo, even though the dual roles contributed to the exhausting production experience. Fact 11. $45 million budget, $8.5 million gross. Nothing But Trouble stands as one of Hollywood's most spectacular financial disasters, and the numbers tell a story of ambition meeting reality in the harshest possible way. Warner Brothers initially gave Dan Aykroyd a budget of $40 million to bring his bizarre vision to life, which was already a substantial amount for a comedy in 1991. To put that in perspective, Jurassic Park was made just 2 years later for only $63 million, showing just how much money Warner Brothers was willing to invest in Aykroyd's directorial debut. However, that $40 million budget didn't last long. The production went $5 million over budget, bringing the total cost to $45 million. The reason for the overrun wasn't waste or incompetence, but rather Aykroyd's creative philosophy. He gave his crew free rein to design and build whatever they could imagine, since the character of Judge Valkenheiser was supposed to have a mechanical engineering degree. This resulted in elaborate sets filled with functioning gadgets, props, and mechanical contraptions. From the bone stripper roller coaster death machine to the miniature train that circled the dinner table shooting pickles, every bizarre idea made it onto the screen. The mansion set, the junkyard filled with polished toasters and stacked buses, and all the intricate trapdoors and hidden elevators cost real money to construct. When the film opened on February 15, 1991, it debuted at number 8 in 1,671 theaters, earning just under $4 million on opening weekend. The second week saw a 50.5% drop in ticket sales, and by the time it finished its theatrical run, Nothing But Trouble had grossed only $8.479 million domestically. This meant Warner Brothers lost approximately $36 million on the project, making it not just a box office bomb, but a catastrophic financial failure that would haunt everyone involved and effectively end Dan Aykroyd's career as a film director before it ever really began. Fact 12. Fantasy artist Boris Vallejo created promotional art. When Warner Brothers needed promotional artwork for Nothing But Trouble in 1991, they made an unusual choice by commissioning Boris Vallejo, one of the most celebrated fantasy artists in the world. Vallejo was already a legendary figure in the art community, having spent decades creating muscular, dramatic cover illustrations for science fiction and fantasy novels featuring characters like Conan the Barbarian, Tarzan, and Doc Savage. His hyper-realistic painting style, which typically showcased powerful warriors, mythical creatures, and exotic landscapes, had become instantly recognizable to fans of the genre. The decision to bring Vallejo on board for this bizarre comedy horror film was particularly strange because his portfolio consisted almost entirely of serious fantasy and action work, with only a handful of comedy projects scattered throughout his career, including National Lampoon's Vacation and European Vacation. Vallejo created an original oil painting on paper measuring 39 inches by 25.5 inches for the film's promotion. The artwork attempted to capture the unsettling tone of Dan Aykroyd's vision, blending the grotesque elements of the judge's mansion with the film's darkly comic atmosphere. For an artist whose bread and butter came from painting heroic figures, battling dragons, or standing triumphantly over defeated enemies, tackling the weird world of Valkenvania must have presented a unique creative challenge. The promotional illustration featured Vallejo's signature attention to detail and dramatic composition, though it struggled to convey exactly what kind of movie audiences were about to experience. The original painting later appeared at heritage auctions, where it was offered for sale as part of a collection of Vallejo's film poster work. Despite the film's catastrophic reception and box office failure, the artwork itself stands as an interesting artifact from Hollywood's willingness to take creative risks in 1991, even if those risks didn't always pay off at the box office. Fact 13. Aykroyd wrote Apology, letter to cast after Nothing But Trouble, crashed and burned at the box office in early 1991. Dan Aykroyd did something that very few directors in Hollywood have ever done. He sat down and wrote a personal apology letter to the entire cast, taking complete responsibility for the film's failure. This wasn't just a quick email or a casual conversation, but a genuine written acknowledgement that he had let everyone down. The letter reportedly expressed how sorry he was for the way everything had turned out, and he made it clear that the blame should fall entirely on his shoulders, not on any of the talented actors who had trusted him with their time and reputations. This gesture was particularly significant because Aykroyd had worn so many hats on this production. He was the writer, the director, the producer, and he even played 2 major roles under heavy prosthetic makeup. With all of those responsibilities stacked on top of each other, he was essentially the face of the entire project. When critics savaged the film and audiences stayed away in droves, there was really no one else for the industry to point fingers at. Chevy Chase himself would later comment that Aykroyd took a massive career hit because he had been involved in so many aspects of the production that no one else had a high enough profile to share the blame. The apology letter showed a level of humility and accountability that's rare in Hollywood, where directors often blame studios, test audiences, or other factors when their films fail. Aykroyd could have pointed to the studio interference, the budget overruns, or even the difficult behavior of some cast members. But instead, he chose to own the disaster completely. For the actors who had put their faith in him, especially his close friend John Candy, this sincere acknowledgement of responsibility likely meant a great deal, even if it couldn't undo the damage the film had done to everyone's careers. Fact 14 originally had 3 different titles. Nothing But Trouble went through a confusing series of name changes that reflected the chaotic production behind the scenes. The film that eventually hit theaters in February of 1991 started its life with a completely different identity, and the title shuffling became a source of frustration for director Dan Aykroyd, who never got to use the name he actually wanted for his bizarre comedy horror creation. When Dan Aykroyd first wrote the screenplay in 1990, he titled it Git, which was meant to capture the gritty backwoods horror elements of the story. The name suggested something rough and unpolished, fitting for a tale about wealthy city folks getting trapped in a decaying rural town. However, as production moved forward and filming began on May 7, 1990, the studio decided that Git didn't quite capture what the movie was trying to be, so just 2 months into production on July 12th, they changed the title to Valkenvania. Valkenvania was Aykroyd's preferred choice, and it made perfect sense for the film since that was the actual name of the fictional ghost town where all the horrifying events took place. The title gave the movie a specific identity and suggested a unique world that audiences would be entering. Aykroyd felt strongly that this was the right name for his creation, and a Christmas 1990 release date was even scheduled under this title. But Warner Brothers had other ideas. In December of 1990, just weeks before the planned release, the studio made the decision to rename the film one final time to Nothing But Trouble. The change came as the studio delayed the release to February and rescheduled The Bonfire of the Vanities to take the Christmas slot instead. On December 20th, a frustrated Dan Aykroyd released a press statement making his feelings clear, publicly stating that he would always think of the film as Valkenvania, regardless of what name appeared on the marquee. The studio's decision to override the director's vision on something as fundamental as the title was just one more sign of the troubled production that would ultimately result in one of Hollywood's most notorious flops. Fact 15. Giant babies based on Aykroyd's dreams. If you thought the giant mutant babies in Nothing But Trouble were just weird creative choices dreamed up in a writing room, you'd be half right. The grotesque characters known as Bobo and Lil Devil, who live in the Valkenvania junkyard and play cards with Demi Moore's character, weren't the result of typical brainstorming sessions or script doctor suggestions. These disturbing adult-sized infants wearing diapers actually came directly from a series of recurring dreams that Dan Aykroyd was having while he spent 6 months writing the screenplay. During the development process, Aykroyd was experiencing vivid nightmares that featured these bizarre, baby-like creatures, and rather than dismiss them as random subconscious imagery, he decided to incorporate them directly into his script. The characters became central figures in the film's most unsettling sequences, representing the twisted family dynamics of Judge Valkenheiser's household. Bobo, who was played by Aykroyd himself under heavy prosthetic makeup, and his twin brother, Lil Devil, were portrayed as severely deformed grandsons of the judge who lived among the piles of scrap metal and discarded vehicles. The dream-inspired creations turned out to be some of the most memorable and disturbing elements of the entire movie, with their pale, hairless appearances and infantile behavior contrasting sharply with their enormous adult-sized bodies. In one particularly uncomfortable scene, Lil Devil becomes eager to win Diane as a prize in a card game, while both characters make various attempts at what could generously be called flirtation throughout the film. The decision to base these characters on actual dreams rather than conventional horror movie tropes speaks to Aykroyd's willingness to mine his own subconscious for material, no matter how weird or potentially off-putting the results might be. Critics and audiences found these dream-based characters deeply unsettling, with many reviewers singling out the giant babies as particularly disturbing examples of the film's grotesque aesthetic.